Well, what I was noticing is that in a lot of the collective impact efforts that we were involved in facilitating and others that we were researching was kind of a peculiar anomaly. The structure of, if those of you who have been involved in collective impact, and if you haven't, you may be aware, you're really bringing together all these members of the system and you're facilitating the process of, this common agenda being developed and implemented over time. And it is a systemic, what I'll call a container. It's a great container for doing systemic work. But what I was seeing, both in the efforts that I was involved in and others, is that the groups were coming up with program strategies, not systemic strategies. So they were working really hard collectively and they'd say, great, we found a great after school program. We want to see if we can scale that. They'd say more people need to know about the resources that exist. So let's put out a resource guide. How many times I've heard that. So looking at this, we're saying, okay, we've got this great systemic structure to do the work, but we're not going deep enough in terms of systems change strategies. And I realized that a lot of people didn't really know how. And in fact, you bring up the word systems change and people say, yeah, we want to do that, but they don't really even know what that means. And I also came to the conclusion that I didn't really know how to support communities in getting deeper on systems change. And so that's what led to this, we fondly call it the upside down triangle of thinking about conditions. But, first was, how do we actually describe what systems change is? And before we even came up with sort of, our picture of systems change, we said, okay, we've got to describe systems change in a way that people can hold on to. And I looked, around the world for great definitions and didn't feel like we had to come up with one. And this definition actually comes from Social Innovation Generation in Canada. And they said systems change is about shifting the conditions that are holding the problem in place. Shifting the conditions that are holding the problem in place. And I felt, at least for myself and others that I talked to, that this was an evocative, it was a visual way for those of us that are doing this work to see what's going on. So even if you put an awesome program and you target it right into the community, if the conditions around it, if the context, if the right policies are in place, if there's, if there's sort of a racist narrative, et cetera, that we won't be able to actually advance the success of those programs. So the first was really just coming up with sort of a definition. And then we got to, okay, what are the conditions that you actually want to change? And there's not one condition, there's not 30, but through our research, we said, okay, there's basically 6. And the first occur what we call the structural level. These are, I think, are pretty self-explanatory to folks. Policies, and that's both policies that are legislative, and then also policies that occur at an organizational level, like school discipline, for example, in education. Practices, around teaching and learning, et cetera, and then resource flows, and that's both dollars and information. So we said that's a structural level, and you can see that. You can research that. It's pretty clear if you wanted to go and figure out in a community what the policies, practices, and resource flows are. If you spend enough time, you can get at it. Then we said there's one level deeper below that. And that's what we called the relational level. And that's around relationships and connections and power dynamics. Let me just give you one mini story about the power of relationships and connections. There was a researcher in Chicago wanted to understand what drove academic performance. So they researched 100 schools over a 10-year period. And they academic performance in this case was defined as improvement in math scores and reading scores. And after 10 years, they looked at what they had and they said, what are we seeing in terms of what drives performance? And it could have been things like more effective professional training for teachers, could have been more effective curriculum. But the number one thing that drove performance was what they ended up calling relational trust. It's when teachers and students and administrators and parents got along well, when they trusted each other. That actually drove academic performance. And when they didn't trust each other, they couldn't even pull off a birthday party. And so that is we often think about relationships and connections as being soft, but they are serious drivers of change. Power dynamics, I think most people, I'm guessing, are familiar with that. You may even be familiar with the sort of the notions of thinking about sort of power over and power with. and how do we build power, which I would say is sort of the capacity for marginalized voice to speak. How do we share power? And then, that's sort of if we're in power, how do we, engage in co-creation? And how do we wield power? How do we advocate for others to have equal voice? So very critical part of systems change. And then the deepest part of systems change is what we call mental models, the transformative aspect of change. And this is basically, what are the belief systems that you have that actually inform your actions? And on another day, if I have another time with you, we could go much, much deeper on any of these, and particularly mental models. But I think the important thing, there are a couple of sort of things to take away from this. One is that, my experience has been that, the majority of sort of mainstream social sector efforts around systems change occur at the structural level. They don't go into the deeper levels of relational change and transformative change. When you look at probably the most successful systems change efforts in the world over time, they've been movement-based. And movements typically start, I would say, in the bottom left-hand corner and work up, right? So we've got to include in our thinking, all 6 of these conditions and not just focus at that top level. You can think about the top level as structural or technical. We can think about the second and the third levels as more cultural. And there's an interdependence in the conditions. So as we think about where there's leverage, we always need to keep in mind the fact that all of these are interacting at sort of any one point in time.